What's going on, baseball fans? How you doing? So we have a special guest today. You might know him in the baseball world. He goes by Foolish Baseball, aka Bailey. Bailey, what is going on, my friend? How you doing?
Doing well, hanging in there, trying to get through the lockout blues.
Yeah, it's been a pretty frustrating time. It's cold, it's lonely out there, and it's funny because on MLB Trade Rumors on their website, they actually just put a contest up acknowledging that it's slow, obviously, and they just put a contest on what date do you think the lockout will end? So let's start off with that. When do you think the lockout will end? If you could give a prediction on a day, what day would you say?
I think spring training's going to be maybe a little bit delayed, but that they'll still get it done in time to start the season in relative normal fashion. So I think you may see players return to spring training on like March 10th or something like that. And maybe the season starts a week later than planned. So I think there will be some delay, but I still feel pretty good that we're going to get a full normal season for the most part.
Yeah, to me personally, it feels like it's just the smaller details that you got to iron out. Those little details that can, take pretty long. But I feel like we haven't been hearing anything negative, so that's good at least. So, my guess, I'm a half glass, I'm a glass half full kind of a guy. I went with in the beginning, I went with middle of January, but now I'm hoping February 1st because I feel like if you were to get everything on time normally you're gonna, because there's so many free agents out there, and it's not just where they're gonna play, where they're gonna live. It's kind of hard when you're working against time like that, especially with if guys are gonna be moving across the country or whatever it may be. So either way, hopefully, for everyone's sake, hopefully it's over soon. So, but let's get to the interview here. Let's get to the questions here. So, your channel, it's really grown over the last year or two into a phenomenon in the baseball world on YouTube. You've even gotten to the point where you've talked with even major league players at spring training, which is awesome. But the goal for me in this interview is just to get to know you more as a person. And I'm just going to start off with a simple question, or it could even be complex. Who is Foolish Baseball?
Foolish baseball is, I think, someone who is no better than you, like the baseball fan watching this, but maybe just happened to get lucky in some ways. So I around 20 end of 2018, I made a video about Justin Verlander that the algorithm just went crazy with, and I've just been trying to kind of ride that wave since, and I've ridden that into full-time content creation. But I think if you were to really like dig into my background or whatever, I don't think you would find that I'm any more special than the average baseball fan. I was just able to hit on the right video in the right format at the right time, and here I am today talking to you.
Yeah, and I will say that's what I appreciate about just your channel. And even though you're obviously you love the analytics, you love the advanced numbers, you seem relatable. And that's what I feel like in today's world people want is they want someone they can relate to. And you're very active on Twitter as well. And so yeah, that's what I think is a big part of your channel. That's what I like about it is it feels like you're someone that you can just sit next to at a game, have a hot dog and just watch a game and talk baseball with. And that's what I appreciate it. But you're also bringing a bit more of an advanced feel to it. So um, before we get into more of like the analytical kind of stuff, how did you get into the game of baseball? What is kind of your background on that?
Well, I can't really remember a time in my life where I wasn't a baseball fan. I was born in 1995 to Braves fan parents right in the middle of their division streak run, and they won the World Series that year. And so for me, I just always grew up in a baseball centric, especially like Braves centric household. So I've always been a baseball fan. And I played T-ball and little league and all that stuff growing up. And then as far as like maybe my interest in the statistical side of baseball I was always a sports almanac kid. Like I like to pour through giant books full of stat leaderboards. And I guess what sort of turned me on to the more analytical perspective of the game was reading Moneyball.
Mm.
Probably few years after it'd come out, maybe 5 years after the book had come out, but I was 12 or 13, and I still, had a love of traditional baseball stats, but this maybe allowed me to prioritize certain things on the fly. And so, I became a OBP rather than an average guy at the age of 12 or 13. And that sort of
Yeah.
led me down this path.
So would you say for because you had more of an advanced feel for the game for the stats, is that what got you into out of the park baseball originally? Because that was what your channel was first built on. If you go back to the early parts of your channel, you did a lot of out of the park baseball. Would you say that was easy for you to kind of pick up that game rather than MLB the Show or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who had what I would call, a rudimentary understanding of all of these advanced stats, like OTP does become easier to pick up. But one reason why I started with it was because I felt like I had a level of understanding of the game OTP and these stats that was still probably like relatable and attainable for someone who didn't. It's not like I was like some genius who was working in a front office and had been playing the series for a decade. I'd only picked up the game a couple years prior to making videos for it, so it was really about, okay, I have this level of understanding that I can probably bring people up to. So yeah, the first videos I made on the channel were basically tutorials on how to play the game out of the park baseball, because I loved the game, but also there was kind of a dearth of YouTube content about it. It's not really a big YouTube game like you said, MLB the Show.
Yeah, and it's a game that I've started to try. I watched one of your tutorials, and you said it's not really it's a game that's it's a little hard. Might be a little hard for a first time user. It might be a little too much. What would you for people that would like to get into that game? What recommendations would you have personally? To help someone kind of get into that game a little bit more, because it can be a little intimidating when you're looking at everything.
Yeah, I would probably be sure to start with like a fairly forgiving team in a fairly forgiving situation. So, might not want to start with the smallest budget teams. You might want to start with a team that has a pretty deep farm system.
Mhm.
Um, you can interpret that however you will. Some people might jump to certain teams in their mind when I say that, but I would definitely check out the YouTube channel PF Holden. He's sort of taken the crown, I think, for OOTP YouTube at the moment. He
Mhm.
has a tutorial series that is more up to date than mine. He has a very in depth playthrough series that he does, and so I would definitely check that out. But yeah, I think my suggestion for someone getting started is probably just maybe familiarize yourself a bit with some stats that are maybe more predictive in a smaller sample. So if you have relievers, for example, that you're trying to deal with in that game, maybe look at FIP more than ERA, for example.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That game. It's honestly, to me, it's amazing just because of how far back it goes. And I got introduced to that game with when we had the pandemic first happening, and they did the MLB Dream brackets. I thought that was rather entertaining, and I was just really impressed by just how far back and how just rich in the numbers that it was. When you did you pay attention to the MLB Dream bracket during that time?
I honestly didn't, but probably because I was too busy just playing OTP instead of seeing all the buzz around it. And I'm a pretty strict single player OTP guy, so I don't think I really keep up with the meta or like what's going on, in terms of like what they're promoting, because I'm usually just like trapped like 20 years into the future trying to figure out how to re-sign like my 28-year-old superstar center fielder from the Bahamas who's completely CPU generated by that point.
Yeah, one team with that game that I would like to actually plug into. This kind of ties into how you said you're an Atlanta Braves fan. The 1998 Atlanta Braves. They were. I feel like that's a forgotten team just because obviously they didn't go very far. Is there a particular Atlanta Braves team that you would love to that you think could go far, and like when it comes to ranking the best teams ever?
Yeah, especially as far as one that like you said maybe didn't go all the way. I mean,
Hmm.
the 2003 Braves were such a subversion of what we'd come to expect from them.
Hmm.
They were such a pitching centric team in the 90s, and then in 2003 the offense just went bananas, and they just had the numbers put up by some of these guys like Andrew Jones had a really good season that year, and Javi Lopez had like just this insane year that year, and
Yeah.
they weren't um we were kind of past like the three aces at that point, but that was just a really
Hmm.
fun team. I think 2003 Braves, and then also growing up I was also partial to the 2005 Braves, which were the baby Braves, which is where you saw call
Yeah.
ups of
Yeah.
McCann and Frank Coor. I thought that was a
Hmm.
really fun team as well.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the Atlanta Braves, obviously they've just won the World Series. What are your reflections on this past season as a Braves fan? To me, it was a very interesting season. They didn't get to a lot of wins overall, but they had a big deadline and a big second half. Just looking back at this past season, how would you what are your reflections on this past season?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think, and you're a Red Sox fan, presumably, so you've seen it.
Oh wait, oops, oh wrong. I know.
Yeah, you've seen your team win the World Series multiple times now, and I hadn't done that. I mean, the Braves won when I was 2 months old, but I have no, memory of that.
Yeah.
So I think when you see your favorite team win the World Series, I think the question for me is like, how much does it irreversibly alter the fan experience? To me, it almost feels like getting the commissioner's trophy in the hands of Freddie Freeman was like the end of like fandom itself, like the logical conclusion of all of this. So it's like, for me, what I'm curious is like, how long into next season will I stop caring that they won the World Series? Like, when will I get mad that they lose a game on, a crummy call, or, Brian Snitker makes some managerial decision that I disagree with, even though they had just won the World Series a few months prior. So I think that's really sort of my takeaways. Okay, now I've seen them win the World Series. How will that affect fandom going forwards? Because I do think it changes the dynamic to some degree. Maybe you disagree.
No, I absolutely agree. And I had to kind of learn the hard way in 2004 when they won. I was in ninth grade in high school. I wasn't, as big into the numbers at that point. Batting average, home runs, the surface numbers. Yeah. But when they won in 2004, I'm thinking, all right, 2005, sure, we lost Pedro. Kurt Schilling, he's got a bum ankle, but we're gonna repeat. We're gonna be good to go. And that was when they brought in David Wells, which blew my mind that he was in a Red Sox uniform. Still to this day, Matt Clement was very good early on in that season, and I think just because they won, I was still on such a high even when they made it to the postseason, and then we just ran into a buzzsaw of a White Sox team in that postseason, and it almost I couldn't believe what happened at that point. But looking back on it, I'm not. I would say I still have a lot to learn when it comes to more advanced numbers and whatnot. But looking back, like I understand why that team lost. In the moment, I didn't, and I was like sad, and I was thinking like, "Wow, man, we still had Manny Ortiz. Like, how did this happen?" And over the years, and sure, like as a Red Sox fan, and everyone else in Red Sox Nation, we have been spoiled. But over the years, it's really, I would say, it's actually helped me learn more about how teams, how these winning teams do get put together. And you start to appreciate the farm system a little bit more. You start to appreciate just other aspects of how these teams do get put together. Because I mean, as a Red Sox fan, sure, we have definitely been spoiled with championships, but we've also had with those championships very big up and downs where, 2013, bam, 2014, Lester traded, bad season, 2015. That was the year of who's the ace at that year with, Clay Buckles and, I can't remember who the other Wade Miley, I believe, is in that rotation. And so we've had our ups and downs, but that's really helped me kind of learn, more of just the game itself over time. That's to me, I think, for Braves fans, you got the taste. But what I like for the Braves moving forward is there is a lot of good young players there still. There's a good farm, and obviously Snicker's a good manager. It's a, hopefully with Freeman, we'll see if whatever they do with him, but I still think it's a very strong team. And what do you think about for the Braves for next season?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in a pretty good spot next season overall. Like we'll see, maybe the Mets have more moves up their sleeve, but I think they probably come into next year as favorites or co-favorites for the East, just
Yeah.
like they did last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like where they're at. The guy that I would personally want to bring back from this championship team that's now a free agent would be Jorge Soler.
Hmm.
I just think he's the right fit in maybe ways that Eddie Rosario and Jock aren't. And yeah, I think will be sort of interesting for the Braves is, last year, even though some of these guys didn't make huge impacts in the World Series per se, there were a lot of like younger pitchers called up. So,
Hmm.
Tucker Davidson,
Yep.
Huascar Inoa, Kyle Muller. It's gonna be interesting to see like how those guys populate the back end of the rotation. Kyle Wright as well, I guess. So that's gonna be something to definitely pay attention to with the Braves. But I mean, I like where they're at. They obviously the top priority is getting Freddie Freeman back.
Yeah, and that's my last question before we move on. Would be if you had a choice. I mean, I know the sentimental is Freddie Freeman, but do you feel like numbers wise and everything, when you look at everything, do you feel like he is the right guy to bring back over, let's say, a Matt Olson or maybe even another option?
Well, it's good. I think it would be really hard for the Braves to get Matt Olson because I'm not sure if they have the level of prospect capital necessarily, or that they would be willing to give up. I
Yeah,
think a team with like a really deep system would make sense to go get someone like Matt Olson, for example. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean, and I know, knowing the business of baseball, I know how the playoff shares work too. Like
yeah,
the team's probably fiscally doing pretty well.
yeah.
So I think it would make more sense to spend like cash on Freeman than exchange prospects for Olson,
Hmm.
just based on where the Braves are at. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, and sentimentally speaking, Freddie to me is the team in so many ways, like probably the way you felt about Ortiz, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So just, I know I've come to terms with the fact like there is very much a chance that he will leave. And then, at that point I can just kind of feel, okay, mission accomplished. We won the World Series with him. Right. But, um, as far as where he's at statistically, he's still Freddie Freeman every year. So I
Mhm.
think, you can go out and give him, 6 years, 180 million, and it'll be okay. I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff anytime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at his numbers, he's such a just an all around, just really good hitter. Where with Matt Olson, you will be getting a couple more years of control and cheaper. But I feel like Freeman at this point, just what he brings to the table offensively, just a good all around bat, but then also just what he brings, for the city of Atlanta, and just for the clubhouse and everything. I feel like he is the right fit personally. I would think Matt Olson, you kind of nailed it right there with the Braves. They do have some good prospects to part with, but when you look at they have depth as well. But I think other teams might be set up better for a Matt Olson trade. I think to me, the Yankees just make a ton of sense when you look at the values of the prospects, and even a team like the Cleveland Guardians maybe even makes some sense where they could use an upgrade at first, and they have a lot of depth and they have some higher level prospects. Question is, would they want to bring him in, considering he's probably going to want a big contract eventually? So it's going to be interesting with him for sure. So if you were to make a prediction, where do you think he ends up?
I would say Yankees, but I mean, I
Yeah.
like Cleveland as a pick too. Like, I'm a big Cleveland Guardians farm system guy. They just
Hmm.
have so much depth there. So I think, if there was a combination of prospects, maybe, for example, infield prospects, Oakland's maybe not so great at the middle infield positions over the last few years, especially,
Yeah.
with Simeon gone. So yeah, I mean, a trade where Cleveland moves maybe one or two of those middle infield prospects for Olson would make sense, I think.
Yeah, and it seemed like the Rangers too, considering they just brought in two middle infielders for how long. They have plenty of infield depth in that farm system, and they have pretty good values. So we'll have to see where he goes. I think for the Rangers, that could be a pretty fun fit. That middle of the order would be just mind-boggling. But let's move on here. Let's get into your channel a little bit. So the big focus of your channel is the baseball bit series, and to me, it's such. I wouldn't. to me, it's the most unique thing in the baseball world of YouTube, but it's honestly one of the more unique things I've seen on all of YouTube. Like when you really, when I'm not just a baseball guy, surprisingly enough, I follow other channels as well, and just the production value of it's one of the most unique things I've ever seen. Um, with it because it has that classic arcade game feel. Have you always been like? Is that how the production comes? Have you always been a fan of like classic arcade games, or like could you kind of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes to some extent, right? I wouldn't consider myself like a huge, retro game fan by any means. But I mean, I definitely have an interest in them.
Mhm.
But I think, the format for baseball bits was sort of born out of my own personal technical limitations. I
Mhm.
wanted the videos to have a specific look to them, but I wanted it to be a look that, I myself would be capable of producing on a technological level. And so, for example, I'm not a great artist. I couldn't sit down and draw you a picture of, David Ortiz with my hand, but over time through brute force, I could maybe learn how to do pixel art of David Ortiz, where I'm basically just tracing over a picture of him.
Yeah.
And to me, good YouTube videos have sort of a design language to them. And, for me, a goal has always been I want people to be able to mute the video, not hear my voice and still know very quickly like who made it. Because I think when your video has a
Mhm.
specific look that they can associate with the channel itself, I think that just sort of builds up the connection between viewer and channel.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, and I think that's even a good tip for just people trying to start up channels and whatnot. That was kind of one thing with my channel. It's a little a little smaller, but that was one thing. How do I stand out? That's the one thing I think a lot of people, if they're going to start a channel, that's the one thing you should look at. What can set you apart, and like you said, if you turned off the volume, do you have that unique look? With that sort of a feel for your videos, that retro gaming kind of look. Uh, do you remember kind of what sparked that? Do you remember like what was like the inspiration, like immediately behind it? Like, did you stumble upon it, or was it kind of something else?
No, I almost can't remember. Like, I just remember
Mhm.
being like, this is what the video should look like. And I just, like I said, kind of at the beginning of this interview, I got lucky. Like, I landed on a format and it's still basically that same format
Yeah.
now 3 years later, so
Yeah.
I can't remember really conscientiously making the decision like, oh, I'm going to make a baseball video that looks like a retro arcade game. I just
Mhm.
remember sitting down wanting to make a baseball video and thinking to myself, well, it should look like something, shouldn't it,
Mhm. Yeah. So my favorite one, I'm a little biased, was the Pedro Martinez video. That to me, I can go back and watch that probably once a week, just because I love Pedro Martinez. And anytime I can watch Pedro highlights, but also see some numbers, that's fine and dandy with me. Which one out of all the baseball bits videos that you've made, which one has been the most satisfying for you to make?
It's one of the most popular videos I've made, but it's the one about Rod Barajas, which is
Hmm.
called "The Catcher Who Couldn't Throw."
Yeah.
Um, it was satisfying to make because as a topic, it had been on the shelf for a while.
Hmm.
I keep a list of topics, and sometimes I'll come up with a topic right on the fly and get to work on it, and sometimes I'll sit on it for a while. And this is when I sat on for a while. And what prompted me to really prioritize it was, you know, that moment where I go back and I look at, his pop time and I realize, hey, this guy wasn't actually nearly as bad as the, stolen base and caught stealing numbers against him would seem to show. So, that was satisfying because I think I had to watch and capture a lot of footage of Rod Barajas having a tough time,
Hmm.
basically.
Yeah.
But you've got like a fun twist at the end, and I think just the success of the video kind of speaks for itself. Like I think people really enjoyed it. So I think as
Mhm.
far as just satisfying to put together, I would say that one.
Now for the looking at the other part, looking at the other end, which one do you think was the toughest to make?
Well, the Pedro one's definitely up there. It's
Yeah.
the longest by duration. I think it's 24
Mhm.
minutes long, and so, I don't know what possessed me in that moment to make a baseball bits that was, close to twice as long as the normal one. So I think that, I mean, my computer certainly had a tough time with that one in terms of rendering it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think also what can be a difficult but also kind of fun challenge for me is anything dealing with old timey baseball. I've made videos about the
Mhm.
Cleveland Spiders. I made videos
Mhm.
about Old Hoss Radbourne. I made a video about Bobby Wallace. And I think anything dealing with a time where there's no real video footage of these guys playing, and maybe there's like 5 photographs of them taken in their entire lives.
Mhm.
That's interesting because, you know, often I find myself, relying on MLB footage to sort of supplement, my narrative so I can, show things to people, videos. This is a visual medium that I work in. And when that's stripped away, the question is, how do I still keep what's happening on screen visually interesting? So whenever I'm dealing with, a topic like that, I have to make, way more graphics and just keep things really fresh for the viewer, else they'll get bored, because I can relate to this. I very much have like warped like attention span from the internet, basically. And so me
Yeah.
knowing that, and me knowing my viewers are like that, it's almost like, you got to keep like jingling the keys in front of their faces and showing them like flashing colors to keep people interested. And I'm not saying that talking down to them. I'm saying that
Right,
because
right.
my
No, I
brain's the
know
same
exactly what you
way.
mean.
So I know exactly what they're dealing with whenever they're sitting down to watch a 15-minute video. It's
Mhm.
not always easy to watch a 15-minute video.
Yeah, yeah. Would have you had any issues at all with because this is something I've heard other baseball YouTubers have an issue with, just like with copyrights and anything like that. Have you had any, issues running, have you ran into anything like that?
Yeah, well, I got started at a pretty lucky time. I
Mhm.
almost think if I had tried to do baseball bits a few years earlier, I probably would have ran into copyright trouble, and maybe, to the point where I would have gotten 3 copyright strikes and the channel would have been deleted. But, as I was putting these videos together, I had exchanged some messages with an MLB employee who basically told me, where MLB is at right now is that the bots, like the content ID bots, will still scan for, MLB content and claim if they find it. Um, but that there's no like manual takedown, or very rarely a manual takedown anymore, where, and you have an MLB employee, searching up YouTube to try to find copyright content. And so for me, like where I stand in terms of copyright at the moment is, okay, I have, obviously I'm doing this full time, so I have to be able to monetize the videos and put ads on them.
Right.
So I edit in a way that the bots won't detect, and then I trust MLB to not go back and manually claim later. There's been a couple times where the bots found a video after the fact. Maybe it had been up for a month or two.
Yeah, I've had
Um,
that.
a good example. So here's one. My Tim LaCastro video. I put up some. My Tim LaCastro video had some footage from that season. I guess it would have been 2019. And then at the end of the season, MLB basically put the 2019 season into their content ID. So there's a bunch of new stuff getting tripped up and called out by the bots. And from there, I actually found I was able to appeal, and the claim got dropped in like a few
Mhm.
days. So as far as where I stand on copyright, like I think there's definitely an understanding as a YouTube creator that, if the copyright holder changes their policy, there's really nothing you can do. If MLB wants to go back and claim every video I've made, then I'm pretty much done, right?
Mhm.
I'm not going to be able to take them to court, and as the copyright holder, they can do whatever they want. Free
Mhm.
use isn't as flexible as people think it is. It's just, more of sort of like a common sense sort of type of defense. But yeah, I think you just have to trust as a creator that they won't do that, basically,
Yeah.
that it would be, it's now reached a point where it would be unhelpful for them to do
Mhm.
that, because that would be the end of baseball bits. And if this is how some people have become baseball fans and that's the end of it, then, maybe in the long run, it's best that they kind of leave me alone. I think that's what most people hope for, right? They don't
Yeah.
necessarily want the top tier connection with MLB. They just would like to be left alone. And then for the most part, we have that. So I'm thankful for sure, because like I said, if you're dealing with other sports leagues, or even if you're dealing with MLB 5 years ago, it's a completely different experience.
Yeah, and you hit on a good point there where it's, they should be okay as long as you're not abusing it and you're being fair about it, why not, let other let content creators like yourself and, a bunch of others where, they can help grow the game and they can help. It's basically free advertising and if when you really think about it, as long as you don't abuse it. But you mentioned that you do this full time. Let's go back a little bit. Growing up, because I've watched your other channel, which we'll get into in a little bit, but you mentioned that you actually studied abroad and you went to Germany. Did you have other ambitions in life at one point? You said this was kind of, you got lucky, with the channel here, but what were some things, or what were you looking to do when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd asked me in high school, I would have said sports writer probably.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, you could sports YouTube didn't really exist at the time. Like there were
Mhm.
maybe people making money off YouTube when I was in high school, doing like gaming stuff or vlogs or whatever,
Mhm.
but you didn't really have like known sports YouTubers the way you have now, the way people might think about not just like me in the baseball space or John Boy in the baseball space, but also, guys who do basketball or guys
Mhm.
who do football. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think as I was like, you know, getting out of college, I was definitely interested in going to grad school to
Mhm.
do like information science or like library science.
Mhm.
The summer before my senior year, I did an internship at a museum where I was just kind of working through the archives. And
Mhm.
so I think a lot of actually sort of my, willingness to like sit down and research and ability to research is sort of based on those times.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, probably the road not taken for me if I didn't become a baseball YouTuber would have been to go to grad school, basically. And
Yeah.
every day I wake up in the morning and I thank the good man upstairs that I'm not in grad school because every grad school student I know is secretly or even not so secretly miserable. So
Yeah, as a teacher, I work with a few people that they go to grad school and they're not happy people. You went to Germany. How did that all come about? That's really interesting. I'm a European myself. I was born in England,
oh,
and
okay.
so I'm always interested in people that do study abroad. So how did that all come together?
Yeah, so when I was yeah, in undergrad, so in college, I majored in history and German studies. So I learned German throughout college, and then, but when I was in college, I never had the opportunity to study abroad. Most of the German majors in my class did a semester in Berlin. I didn't. It just didn't work out that way. So
Mhm.
for me, like as I was getting to the end of college, a goal of mine was definitely, get to Germany by any means possible. And so I ended up applying for and getting this fellowship program that sent me to Germany for a year after college. And it was great because, I knew I probably had to do grad school or get a real job, but I kind of wanted to delay that. This was basically a 1 year delay on all that.
Mhm.
So I went to Germany for a year. I did 2 months of language school in South Germany, and then went up to North Germany in Hamburg for 10 months. And I audited university classes, and I did some like I had a requisite amount of like volunteer hours I had to do basically. So and a lot of that was spent with baseball teams in
Mhm.
Germany. And so actually that year in Germany, you know, invigorated me, to want to work in America's pastime, which is kind of ironic. But yes, I think just being in Germany, I wanted, you know, some sort of connection to something American. Maybe I was feeling homesick.
Mhm.
And the way that sort of manifested itself was, helping out with these German baseball clubs, and also that was around the time I started the channel and started doing the OTP. So that's kind of where, you know, it's a weird path to take, but yes, going to Germany is what inspired me to become a baseball YouTuber in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I was gonna ask. Like, when during your time in Germany, was there anything that you feel like helped you, kind of like grow as a person, but also, is there anything you could take away from that experience where maybe it even improved how you could operate your channel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, you know, when you strip away like the big salaries and the big production values and the fame, like it made me really appreciate that at the end of the day, I just love baseball. Like I
Mhm.
just, I'd always, thought of baseball in the context of MLB and minor league baseball as well. But just to see, some of these guys that had, because they were like American players too, and some of them had just basically received a phone call and quit their jobs to come play basically semi-pro in a completely different continent, and just to sort of see that, I think I was just able to appreciate baseball as like this grassroots thing more, just from my experiences of German baseball, and just to understand that maybe it doesn't have to be the highest level, like the game itself is just great. So I think that just as a baseball fan helped reinforce that, hey, I'm not just an MLB fan. At all levels I love baseball.
Yeah, and that's one thing I actually appreciated about the KBO. During we had the pandemic and everything, and I didn't even know what the KBO was, and then all of a sudden I'm seeing it on ESPN, and I'm like, oh, there is other baseball, out there. And well, I knew there was other baseball, but the fact that you could just see it, it's interesting. So, but yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's get into let's get into some baseball. Let's get into to some stats. I know you like stats. With with stats, obviously there's so many out there. You got the surface numbers, you got the more analytical numbers. Which ones are your go-tos when if you're quickly evaluating a player, whether they're an offensive player, a pitcher, or even if you're looking at someone's fielding? What are like your go-to numbers that you personally like to look at?
Well, I think offensively, I'm a big advocate for the triple slash.
Hmm.
I like using the triple slash as a jumping off point for a lot of people, because it's like, hey man, if you've just been doing batting average for the last 20 years, you don't even have to give that up. That's
Hmm.
still part of this. And what's great about the triple slash is not only can you get sort of a decent estimation of the total amount of production. You have the components of OPS right there. The triple slash is average on base and slug. You also get to understand the shape of a hitter's production as
Hmm.
well. Because someone could have, a 300 average, a 400 on base, and a 400 slug. That's an 800 OPS. And then someone could have a 220 average, a 300 on base, and a 500 slug. That's also
Hmm.
an 800 OPS. And yet, just from knowing those three numbers, we know that the shape of the production is completely different. These are completely
Hmm.
different hitters. So I love triple slash.
Yeah.
I think as far as like, pitching goes, if we're going to get, maybe a little more in depth, I like looking at strikeout percentage minus walk percentage.
Okay.
I think just pitchers who generally have, like, I would say just a surplus of strikeouts versus their walks are usually pretty good. And then
Yeah.
I like to look at ground ball percentage as well. And I think
Hmm.
sort of those two things, in tandem allow you to look at, pitching from a lot of different angles, because some guys are just going to be strikeout dominant, but some guys are also ground ball dominant. And so there's more than one way to be good at pitching. So I think looking at those two accounts for a lot of the ways you can be good at pitching.
Hmm.
And then defensively, right now where I'm at, I think for infielders, my stat of choice would be defensive runs saved. I think it just accounts for the shift best. For outfielders, Statcast outs above average. And then for catchers, I'm looking at Fangraphs or Baseball Prospectus, their catching stats, particularly their framing stats.
Hmm.
And then if I were to compare players across different eras, I know, for some people watching this right now, this is probably gobbledygook, and some people watching this now are probably nodding their heads. But if you're looking to compare players across different eras or different seasons or different run environments, I really like the plus stats. And the plus stats are
Hmm.
stats where things are normalized to where 100 is always league average, and so you can have a really good indicator of how much better someone was than league average, at hitting or pitching.
Hmm. With with all those stats that you mentioned, because you can kind of find all these numbers everywhere. Do you have a preference of what website you like to use, whether that's Fangraphs, Baseball Reference, Baseball Prospectus, Baseball Savant, or do you like kind of just bouncing around between all of them?
Definitely bouncing around between all
Yeah.
of them. I think probably spend the most time on reference because of StatHead. StatHead's such a powerful stat querying tool. That's probably where I end up the most. But it depends on whatever the need is for the research I'm doing.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at something StatCast or within the StatCast era, then Savant makes sense. But if I'm looking at something, pre-pitch tracking, pre-2008, it's basically worthless. So I think it's
Mhm.
great that, we have all these great sites to choose from, and that they
Mhm.
can work together in tandem. Because what I find is there are certain things that are easier to find on Savant. There are certain things that are easier to find on Prospectus. It just depends on what the need is. So I think for me as a content creator, being able to sort of command all four websites in a way is definitely key for what I do.
Yeah, and I would also add to that too, just the presentation value as well. With Baseball Reference, I feel like sometimes it can be easier to look at the numbers on there, especially with me if I'm doing streaming. It's the the presentation is important for me. But yeah, I think that's really, it depends on really what you're doing. Um, with all the numbers today, which ones, if you were to maybe pick a few, which ones do you feel like are the most underrated?
Yeah, so that's tough because in some ways, I feel like maybe there aren't any that are underrated, depending on what you're looking at.
Yeah.
I would say from a front office perspective, front offices are really smart. They have accesses to things that I don't have. So no matter what I'm presenting on the channel, I'm probably like a few years behind every MLB front office in terms of what I'm able to communicate to the viewer. They can just account for things that I can't. But I think as far as, in the public sphere, I think anything to do with like pitcher deception,
Mhm.
which is something that I haven't even entirely, talked about on my channel. So maybe that's why I would say it's underrated. But basically, when you have pitchers where there's, for example, a disconnect between their arm motion and the way the ball moves. Look
Mhm.
at Josh Hader, right? He's such a side armor, but his fastball has all this, vertical rising
Mhm.
action. When you look at pitchers who their spin axis, the direction they spin the ball is actually different from the way the ball ends up moving. I think those things are underrated because I think a lot of people might have the understanding now. Okay, let's look at this guy's curveball spin rate on Baseball Savant. Let's look at his fastball spin rate on Baseball Savant. But I think what we've discovered is that there's a lot of pitchers who might not have the best spin rates on those pitches and yet are still incredibly deceptive and get
Mhm.
crazy swing and miss stuff, and it's because of you know a disconnect between their arm motion and the ball movement, or a disconnect between the spin axis and the way the ball moves. So I think I would say that's underrated. That's a very technical answer to your question, but just in terms of how we discuss pitching in the public sphere, that definitely stands out to me.
No, I would actually agree with that. During the draft this past year, there was a prospect. I believe he ended up going to college. I could be wrong. His name was Gage Jump. Smaller stature guy, kind of like a Marcus Stroman sort of a size. Not a big fastball. Good curveball he had, but the one thing that really stood out to him in his scouting report was his ability to hide the ball, where it was so he was just such a tough at bat, not because of stuff, not because of velocity, not because of the downhill plane, but just the fact that you couldn't even see the ball coming out of his hand just because of the way his mechanics were. And I think that's a thing I think pitchers are really trying to work on these days, is just being able to just be a tougher at bat, not just with, if you can't get that velocity up, well, you can look at those other things like you mentioned, like deception. So I would agree with you on that. Is there anything offensively that sticks out to you, that like, is there a number that you feel like people don't talk about enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's tougher to say, I think, on offense. In some ways, I still sort of feel like on base percentage is underrated.
Hmm.
So, like, you can look at a stat like WOBA or WRC plus, and I know, like, we know the weights. We know how much, theoretically, a point of on base is worth to run scoring, and a point of slug is worth to run scoring. And yet, still sometimes with those weights in mind, I still kind of feel like on base is king because you're just not making an out, at the end of the day, that's what this is about. You keep the inning going. The way you succeed as a hitter is you don't make an out. So even, there might be hitters where, for example, a hitter with 400 on base and 400 slugging versus a hitter with like 380 on base and 450 slugging. I still kind of like that 400 on base hitter more, even though he doesn't slug as much. And even though, the weights of WOBA and WRC plus would probably tell me the opposite, I still sort of feel like OBP is king because you're not making outs.
Yeah.
But that's kind
Yeah.
of an anti-analytical take in a way,
No, yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think with the game, with the way it's just going, you're only just going to start seeing more and more of these kind of numbers. If you were to make a prediction, do you see, because I think the on base percentage was something that kind of blew up, especially with like the Moneyball A's. Do you see a number in particular, if you were looking at all of them? Is there one number that you think, or one stat that you think could gain traction over the next 10 years when it comes to evaluating a player more in like the mainstream media?
Yeah, I think, maybe they would be interested in like pitches per plate appearance on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of talks about, pitch count and what
Mm-hmm.
type of, what does the position of starting pitcher even look like in the future? Does it even exist? Is the average start going to be 5 innings or 4 innings or 3 innings? So I think
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of workload, a hitter who, forces the pitcher to throw, an extra pitch, every at bat on average, that's a pretty big deal. And then the pitcher who takes, maybe who even gets outs, but just takes longer to get those outs, that's kind of a big deal. So yeah, I could see, individualized pitches per plate appearance maybe being a topic of conversation over the coming years, just in terms of, is this batter going to help wear down the pitcher more by fouling a couple off? Or, is this pitcher going to pitch really efficiently by getting a bunch of ground balls early in the count, for example?
Yeah, and I think another thing that could go hand in hand with that, or any rule changes that happen, especially if they end up implementing like a pitch clock. Will that factor in how many pitches per plate appearance and whatnot? So, are there any rules that you would maybe like to see implemented into the game that you think would make the game better?
I'm a big, big pitch clock guy. Like, I
Yes.
think that no matter what, that's priority number one as far as on the field. I just think it would, and you don't have to do it with runners on, but with the bases empty, I would like to see pitch clock
Hmm.
for sure. That's definitely just, far, far and beyond, any other rule I could think of would be pitch clock. When I did my how to fix MLB video, I think I suggested maybe 18 seconds, which is fairly aggressive.
Hmm.
But, to me, that's just the amount of time spent between pitches is probably the worst thing in the game right now from a spectator perspective.
And you were doing during the playoffs, you were doing some watch parties, and I was doing as many as I could. And the one thing I noticed was just how tight my lower back was getting just sitting, and I could feel it on the games that were just taking longer. And that it was crazy how there were some games that were right around 3 hours, 15, 20 minutes. And then you had a couple, they're in those like 4.5 hour marks, getting up there. And I think, I know a lot of people, they like to get on to Rob Manfred and whatnot, but that is one thing I agree. I would like to see more of, even if it's just kind of getting the pace going, even just a little bit. I think that does help. Just because with people's attention spans and whatnot today. So, but I could definitely feel it during the playoffs at times. There was, a couple of Red Sox games that went a little long. I couldn't really feel it then because it was my own team. But with other games, I think there was one game in the World Series. I think it might have been game one, I believe. It just felt slow. It felt long, and so yeah, that's what I would agree with you on that one.
Yeah, can
With
I just jump in on that real
Yeah, yeah.
quick? Um, a lot of people, the counter argument to that is, oh, don't you love baseball? Don't you want the game to be longer? I hope the game, goes 5 hours or something like that because I love baseball so much. I think in pitch clock discussions, it's not about lessening the amount of baseball. The amount of baseball in each game is about the same on average. You're there
Mhm.
to see the winning team, you know, make 27 outs. And however long that takes is however long it takes. But the amount of baseball in a baseball game on average is going to be the same. So I just would like a higher density of baseball happening so I could get on with my life.
Right. You know, and to me, I want the most efficient game possible. Like, yeah, if it ends up taking, 4 or 5 hours, then okay. But if you can get that done and still have a good game and still have an efficient game in 3.5 hours, I mean, to me, you're only winning in that process. Maybe 15-year-old me was like, oh, 8-hour game, let's do it. But now I'm a grumpy man in his 30s that has to wake up for to go teach second graders in the morning, and maybe I don't want to be that 18 inning game with the Red Sox and Dodgers. That one it was weird to me because it as historic of a game that was, and obviously it was a World Series game with my Red Sox. That was way past my bedtime, and I was really struggling. Actually, I had to take a nap during that game, like a 10. I dozed off for 10 minutes because I just couldn't stay up, and it was also on the West Coast too, so that didn't help. But yeah, so I agree with that. With I mentioned earlier, you have a second channel, Foolish Bailey. What was the inspiration behind that?
When you have an upload schedule like mine, where on the main channel I'm maybe once a month these days, I think there's a certain degree of anxiety almost as a creator that like people will basically forget about you in those 4 weeks in between. And
Yes.
so for me, on Foolish Bailey, I think the goal is definitely to get my face in front of people, because on the main channel I'm just basically a narrator. I'm not really seen. And
Mhm.
then two, just a higher frequency of upload. Something that these if these baseball bits videos take 2 to 3 weeks, let's do a Foolish Bailey video that I can make in a day, hopefully. And so on Foolish Bailey, well, here's a good example. On Foolish Baseball, I made 11 videos last
Yeah.
year, and on Foolish Bailey, I made like 50 something. So I
Mhm.
just think in terms of just putting my face in front of people. That's definitely big. And then also with Foolish Bailey, I'm not constrained by the format of baseball bits in any ways, because sometimes I do find there are interesting topics I would like to talk about, and yet I just, for whatever reason, don't feel like they would work in, a 15-minute video essay format.
Yeah, I noticed with Foolish Bailey, you're doing the watch parties like we mentioned. Do you plan on bringing any more of that to the table, this coming season, or do you have any different plans with that channel in particular?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't, for me, live streaming is is more of like a fun novelty to try maybe a few times a year, rather than, try to make a habit out of it. But yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
I could definitely see myself doing, watch parties during the big games, or, maybe even live streaming, some Q&A type stuff to try to be more interactive with the chat, or
Mhm.
even just streaming some gaming, even, maybe if people wanted to see, an out of the park stream or something like that. So
Yeah.
but I do think for me, like, the bread and butter will still always be like video on demand type content.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, with Foolish Bailey, there's definitely a lot of experimentation as far as format. There doesn't really seem to be, any consistency in terms of length, tone, or subject matter. It's just kind of all over the place, just whatever I'm feeling like at that given day.
Yeah. Well, as for your main channel, Foolish Baseball, what do you have in store for this coming year? Do you have obviously the baseball bits, that's the series, but do you have any new series coming in? Do you have any new ideas, or even just keep on chugging away with the baseball bits? Do you have maybe any previews for anything coming up?
Yeah, I mean, definitely keep chugging away at the baseball bits. There is maybe the slight possibility of a trip to spring training in the cards,
Mhm.
like I did right before the pandemic. But I think for me, two of the goals as far as like what I'll do with baseball bits this year are definitely going to be, create content that maybe changes the way people watch the game of baseball. I'd love to
Mhm.
do something like that. And then also create content that um, does a service to black baseball, to the Negro leagues. I got a little bit of that in my most recent video about Shohei Ohtani, where I compared him to Negro League Hall of Famer Bullet Rogan.
Mm.
I'd like to sort of dig in deeper on that and sort of deify some of these Negro League legends in video format this year. So that's definitely a big goal of mine.
Well, hey man, I'm excited for it, and I think everyone in the baseball world is very excited for it. I always get, because, like you said, you don't upload as much on the main channel, but whenever I see the notification, I'm just like, oh, okay, here we go. So it's always an exciting time, and I'm very certain people are very excited for your channel this coming year. But I want to thank you, my friend, for coming on today, having this talk, just getting, giving the people the opportunity to just get to know you a little bit more. That's the goal, especially during this downtime. I'd love to get to know, more baseball YouTubers during this time. But I want to thank you for coming on today. Yeah, anything else you'd like to add before we get out of here?
I don't have much to add. I think I would just say, if baseball season rolls along and maybe MLB is on delay, we talked a little bit of KBO earlier.
Mm.
I'm an advocate for CPBL. That's the
Mm.
league in Taiwan.
Oh,
What's
yeah,
great
yeah,
about it is that there's only 4 teams. So if you need a backup league, I would suggest KBO is a good one, NPB is a good one. CPBL, you only have to learn 4 teams, so there's an
yeah,
advantage there.
yeah. Well, hey, viewers, make sure you check out some baseball in Taiwan. But Bailey, thank you so much for coming out today. I appreciate you taking the time, and have yourself a good day, my friend.
All right, thank you, Robbie.
Yep. Thank you, man. Have a good day.